participants and listeners from around the world. I'm Kristen Schwartz, licensed midwife and MC for Gold Learning. Our guest today is Rhea Dempsey here at our podcast for Gold. We are getting ready for the Gold Perinatal Online Conference, and I'm here with Rhea today. So welcome, Rhea.
Hi, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you doing today, Rhea?
Yes, I'm very good. I'm in Melbourne, Australia, and it's just the beginning of spring here, although it's still a very wintry type of day. But I'm sitting in my office looking out the window and I can see some sunshine at the moment. So it's very wonderful to be speaking to people all around the world at north and south of the equator, and so all these different weather patterns that are happening.
That is absolutely wonderful. That's one thing I really enjoy about Gold, that we can be together chatting and learning, and we are in completely different on different continents. I'm here in the
Yes.
United States and South Florida. You are in Australia, and many of our listeners are from all over the world, which is just wonderful, which makes it so international. So,
Yes.
Rhea, isn't it fantastic? And tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us about your background and what you've been up to recently.
So just recently, well, maybe I'll come back to that a little while into our discussion, but I came into the birth world, as we're talking about birth, really after the birth of my own first baby, some 40 odd years ago, when I guess nowadays, if I was thinking about that birth, I would think that I was traumatized by her birth with the things that happened and that were, I later found out, were really part of routine procedures rather than something that was really necessary for either her or my well-being. And so I came out of her birth really quite radicalized. So that was the start of my journey into birth, and I've been here ever since. Another few babies for myself after that, and now 4 grandchildren. So that's my background. Before having my first daughter, I was a physical education teacher and outdoor adventure instructor and support person. So I felt that going into that first birth that I knew a thing or two about the body and how it worked and how to work with intensity and how to overcome sort of challenges and sometimes fears about doing things with your body, or taking on tasks and engaging in intense process to achieve some performance. So I felt like that would stand me in very good stead for my own birthing experience, birthing my daughter. So really, with the birth then, how it unfolded, which didn't quite match my expectation, that left me feeling just really quite puzzled by what happened, and then led me to feel like, well, there's a better way of doing this. So here I am, all these years later, then trained as a childbirth educator. I guess so I'm talking really about the 70s here, and at that time in Australia, the home birth scene was really we were starting to reclaim home birth here, as happened in America as well. And I became involved in the home birth scene then, really, I guess. We've since come to be called doulas, but back at that time, really, there was not really a title. We were just with our sisters, and friends, helping out with the birth. And so then, as a childbirth educator and continuing all this time as a childbirth educator, I did probably 20 years ago or longer feel that I would have liked to have trained as a midwife, but not to become a nurse, but really to do what we might call a direct entry midwifery
Right.
training. And a group of us really tried to set one up here in Australia way back then, but in fact it didn't really happen. So it since has, which is wonderful. But for myself at that point, I felt, although loving and still being involved in birth, which I've continued to do, I felt that I needed some further qualification. So I, in fact, went back to university and did counselling and psychology, as I felt that was really a beautiful fit for the work of being with women in labour and supporting them to birth their babies. So I did that so many years ago, and now really my work involves bits and pieces of all that, still attending birth, still educating, childbirth education, doing counselling around birth issues, and sadly, far too much birth debriefing about traumatic or distressing births, and hence the topic that I'm talking about in this Gold Learning program. So I wrote, a few years ago, I wrote a book, I guess, which really came more out of that, the idea of working with the body, the intensity of labour and the intensity of working with the body, which of course in labour for most women involves that functional physiological pain, of their body working strong and hard. And that first book is really of mine, called Birth with Confidence, Savvy Choices for Normal Birth. In that one, I talk much more about that idea of the pain, and that many women reach points in the labour which I call crisis of confidence, where they feel like they can't go on and it's too much for them. And of course, the cultural message often is that, yes, it is too much for them, the poor things, and they really do need to be saved. Whereas coming out of my physical education background, of course, I know that many people can reach those sort of hitting those pain barriers or feeling that lack of confidence, and with good coaching, good support, good encouragement at those times of lack of confidence, that they can really move through them and move into, deepening into the experience of whether it's running or, in our case, birthing, that they can move past those crises of confidence and continue on to unfold into that birth that they're hoping and dreaming for. So that's the core of that first book, sorry. And then you asked me, what am I up to now? Well, I'm just really, I'm right on the tail end, really, within my second book going to the typesetter by the end of next week. So really at the pressure point of completing a second book. And this book is actually looking sort of underneath looking more at the psychological and emotional aspects. That idea of birth is really a holistic experience of the mother, and understanding who she is, not only how her body is, but how her being is, how her spirit, how that wholeness of her comes forward in the birth, and going through a number of the aspects that I've seen, well, not only me, many of us who work in birth, particularly when we have that privilege of working with women that we get to know and be in strong relationship with, we understand that really a lot of the mother is coming to be tested at the birth. And so this second book is more about those psychological aspects that it would be useful, helpful for women to contemplate, both for the birth and also definitely for stepping into mothering. And in the context of that book, there is going to be some discussion about birth trauma and healing from birth trauma, which is, of course, very applicable to this topic again that I'm going to be sharing with Gold Learning. So that's me now. I'm looking forward to finishing that book so that I can come away from my computer a little bit and look out at the world.
That is absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing your journey with us here, and congratulations on your second book there too. That's coming out very shortly.
Yes.
And I think it's just what an amazing background. That's why I love speaking to our talking. That's why how I love talking to our speakers here, because often the journey is amazing. To see how you got from coming from physical education and outdoors adventures, where you really thought you were well prepared for the physical aspects of labor, and then quite shocked and traumatized during your birth experience. So much probably went wrong there, that you didn't get the emotional coaching, you didn't get, what you're talking about in your first book, right? Where you said,
yes.
And then now taking that journey further and becoming a childbirth educator, doula, and then at university becoming a counselor and studying and using now your knowledge and writing a second book for the emotional, exploring the emotional and physiological dynamics. That's kind of this well-rounded, you kind of close the circle there. That's absolutely wonderful.
Yes. Yeah, well, those of us who work in birth in this way, we're so
Yeah,
privileged with so many wonderful experiences of mothers and babies and families and how they grow and develop, and sometimes deep healing can occur with well-supported birth experiences as well. So it's wonderful to have been involved and
yeah.
presumably continue to be involved. And I think something about telling those stories
Mhm.
with permission is a way of, I mean, it's the best way of teaching, isn't it? It's age-old human ways, that sharing of stories. And so those of us who have lots of these experiences, I think sometimes there's some call to share them more
Yeah,
widely. So that's how it
absolutely.
feels for me.
Wonderful. That's so true. We are so blessed to have these experiences with, families and their birth and assisting women in their labor and birth, and as you said, collecting stories and sharing. It's a great way of, uh, teaching and sharing
Yes.
and sharing the message. Absolutely. Now let's talk about your presentation here. It's titled Birth Debriefing, the how and why at the bedside. And I'm very curious about this. Tell us a little bit about the birth debriefing, number one,
Yes.
and
Yes.
about the presentation, the how and why at the bedside. So, if I read your title correctly, and I had a little bit sneak peek of your slides, but I don't know too
Mm,
much about it, right? So, if I read
yes.
this title now, and I'm assuming, so you're going pretty closely soon after the birth into the debrief, as it looks like. Is that correct, the assumption?
So this was the request really to speak about it in this way.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things that I'm bringing forward in this presentation is that, in fact, that idea of a very deep debriefing too soon after a traumatic experience, whether that's birth or any other experience that somebody may befall them in their life, that there's really some concern about going in too deep too early. So I'll certainly be talking about that and what the research is saying about that, but more really what we require at the bedside. So here we're talking in particular to midwives and those who are caring for women in those early days. If the birth has been one that the mother finds to be distressing or
Mm-hmm.
traumatic, then it's about how we're going to be in that space with her, how to listen to her story, how to give her that nurturing and caring and emotional support, not so much to go into a sort of a deeper debriefing, but often to fill in the gaps, what actually happened, why, answer her questions, listen, that beautiful quality of empathetic listening, to listen to that story, not just being so busy and on task mode around the mother and about the baby when there's so many things to do, but to really be in that human presence, to hear
Mm-hmm.
her story, and to what's so important, what the research suggests is so important, that in that early time, as I'm saying, not to go in too deep about it, but to be planting seeds of the positivity, planting seeds of the mother's courage, planting seeds of the mother's capacity to overcome something very difficult or to stay present to something that was very difficult, so that in that early time we're starting, um, yes, a strengthening process for her as she steps into that role of mother. And at a later point, for traumatic births, then certainly for many women they can benefit from psychological debriefing at a later point. But in the first instance, they need to be nurtured, listened to, planting
Mm-hmm.
seeds of some strengthening, because they've got a big task ahead of them, don't they, to be present to that baby. So that's what we're wanting. So these are the sorts. So I'll be talking about also something about the statistics, worldwide statistics about this, something about the definitions about birth trauma, something about the certainly the aspect about what is happening around birth, particularly in westernized countries, of very high rates of intervention, and that many women find um, these interventions to be part of their traumatizing experience. So we've got to understand the idea about birth debriefing and birth trauma putting it in context about where are women birthing, what's happening to them in that birth. And so I'll be going wide. I'll be going in, more personally to how that might be conducted there at the bedside, but really that's got to be in the context of this bigger picture about what's happening around birth. So hopefully it'll be a discussion that lots of people who work with birthing women who are with them in those early days will find useful, and that then can be passed on to the mothers and those sweet babies, so that everybody comes through that with a much more resilient, look to the future as the family life unfolds.
Absolutely, and you brought something up very interesting. Yes, as birth workers, we want to support the mothers and the families after, but sometimes, especially if it was a more traumatic experience, we sometimes often don't know exactly how we best do this. So this is actually very, very useful because often we feel like we're not counselors. Are we really equipped? What can we do here? And what is that we can contribute in a positive way? Because as you mentioned, after the birth, a mother, has to focus then on and wants to enjoy the baby and focuses on
Yes.
the baby and the care and so we need to be able to give her that positive message or enforcement or whatever we can do to help facilitate that and be there for her.
Yes, yes. Whilst not, of course, denying or
Hmm.
dampening down if she does
Oh,
feel,
absolutely.
acknowledging that
Right.
distress that she's feeling, but also bringing forward those, as we say, those seeds of positivity, to be moving into what awaits her now that the birth is finished, and here she has this baby in her arms. So yes, it's a delicate. There's a delicacy there, but really, I think that when practitioners, caregivers are there and open, in a compassionate way, then they can find their way to hold that in a beautiful way for the women. It's just that, of course, a lot of the birthplaces are so stretched and stressed that many of the practitioners are themselves sometimes carrying trauma themselves, but as much as anything, one of the things that women talk about is that everybody seems to be on task mode, that everybody's treating me like a task to be ticked off, whereas what I'm feeling I need is that sort of human connection and compassion and a place of empathy to talk through what happened, or for somebody to hear me. So in some ways it's complex. In other ways, of course, it's very simple. That capacity of one human being to another to really offer an empathetic and attuned, compassionate ear to our story. So I'll be loving to talk that through with people and offer them a few small
Wonderful.
aspects that could be
Absolutely. We are
helpful in their
looking
work.
forward to this presentation here at Gold Rhea. Rhea, this brings us to the end of our chat. I would love to chat more, but we don't also want to give too much away because this presentation is fantastic and we want our listeners to come in and enjoy it. So thank you so much for chatting with me here today, and we're looking forward to having you at the Gold Perinatal Online Conference of 2019.
Okay, thank you very much. Lovely to chat with you. And looking forward to speaking to a wider audience, I think all around the world. How wonderful.
Right. Exactly. So, and now to our listeners, Rhea's presentation, Birth Debriefing the How and Why at the Bedside, will be live on October 15th. And as I mentioned, is part of the Gold Perinatal Online Conference. That conference has over 14 hours of education, international speakers, of course, everything with the topic of perinatal education. So don't miss out. And please visit the website. It's called goldperinatal.com. And we hope to see you there at the Gold Perinatal Online Conference of 2019. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Bye bye.